Bene, buonasera a tutti. Continuerò in inglese perché abbiamo anche tanti collegati anche dall'estero. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to present this new issue of Economia Italiana that has been edited by Lorenzo Codogno and by Pietro Reichlin, and that deals with rethinking debt sustainability. I wish to sincerely thank the editors of this volume and all the contributors. There are many interesting articles included in this issue, and I believe that this issue is going to be an important reference to further stimulate the debate on this important matter. We've actually been living for many years in a very friendly environment characterized by abundant liquidity and extremely low, even negative interest rates. And in such an environment, debt sustainability was clearly not a problem. Let me just remind you of what was going on until a few years/months ago. We had massive purchases of securities, mostly but not only government bonds, by the central banks. The central banks expanded their balance sheets in the last 15 years by factors of 6 to 10 times. That is, if you take the balance sheet of the Fed in 2007 and you compare it with the balance sheet of the Fed in 2021, there is a factor of 9.5 of increase. If it was 100, it was 950, something unbelievable. We recorded negative interest rates not only in the money market, but on the Bund, a 10-year government bond, and even on Italian treasury bonds, up to 3-4 years of maturity. And also during the pandemic, when fiscal policy everywhere had to cope with the extraordinary negative pressures coming from supply and demand contractions and leading to monster fiscal deficits and increases in public debt GDP ratios, still the interest rates remained low because of the great support that monetary policy and the accommodative policy given by the central banks provided. However, starting in the second semester of 2021, the world began to change. It's now characterized by the energy crisis, the return of inflation. Inflation is higher and more resilient and persistent than what was anticipated. There is a lot of uncertainty regarding the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and other geopolitical threats, and still there are some remaining bottlenecks. They are reducing, but there are still some remaining bottlenecks in the supply chain. Central banks started to increase interest rates probably too late, and now are acting very rapidly, and somebody think that they're acting actually too quickly, maybe. There's a concrete risk to destabilize the financial system and to maybe push the economy into a stronger recession than needed. So debt sustainability is again relevant. Let me just mention, and I read them, a few data on the debt GDP ratio in industrialized countries. With the only exception of Germany, the figures exploded everywhere in the last 15 years. And I give you the numbers. US moved from 65% in 2007 to 132% in 2021, more than doubled. UK from 41% to 95%. Canada from 67% to 112%. France from 64% to 112%, close to doubling. Italy from 104% to 151%. Japan from 172% to 263%. So it is well known that debt dynamics, debt GDP ratio dynamics, depends on the difference between the rates of growth of the economy and the average real interest paid, as well as on the capacity of the governments to run primary surpluses when that difference is not favorable. Such dynamics are again challenging in a context of increasing rates and risks of recession. And the matter is particularly relevant in the euro area, where one central bank and one monetary policy interact with several governments and many fiscal stances. Progresses towards the realization of a new EU fiscal space have started with programs such as Next Generation EU and SURE, but are limited and are difficult to expand without being accompanied by strong political decisions in terms of further delegation of powers to the EU from the member states. Suspension of the Stability and Growth Pact has been important in the pandemic, but can't be maintained forever. New fiscal rules will have to be agreed upon and will impose further constraints on the ability of the governments to deal with macroeconomic stabilization. All these issues are discussed in this volume and are going to be the object of today's seminar. I really look forward to learning from the knowledge and the competence of our speakers and from the open debate that will follow. Right after the end of this seminar, there's going to be some cocktails waiting for us outside in the garden. Hopefully it's not going to be too cold, exactly under the new classroom that is named the Dome, that is very close to the bar. I hope we will have some further chance to talk and discuss also during these cocktails. So thank you again, all of you, for being here, and I hope we will have a wonderful seminars.
Okay, so I guess that this is working. Okay, so I am Pietro Reichlin, and I'm the editor of this volume, this special issue on debt sustainability analysis with Lorenzo Codogno. We have collected a number of interesting contributions from policymakers, some academic. As we were saying a few minutes ago, the issue of public debt is with us since the beginning of times. I was very young when we started, I started my career in academia, and we were already discussing about the Italian public debt. And, so what this issue is about, it is about, as I said, debt sustainability, but also there are other issues that are addressed, and many questions. Okay, one question is, do we need a central fiscal capacity at the EU level? Another one is, should we revise the Growth and Stability Pact, the fiscal rules? And then there is another issue that maybe was not present at the time when we started discussing public debt a few years ago, which is, the issue of the so-called European public goods. Okay, so the energy transition, how should we address these important objectives, and whether, public finances will be stressed, or do we need extra deficit or extra debt to address these issues? So let me start a little bit, by, as a kind of tour over the volume. Debt sustainability. So this is one of the most difficult and contentious issues that you can think of. I don't think there is any conclusion that you can really draw from looking, backward at what countries have done in the past, or, making prediction about the future, and establish, clear-cut conclusions about the sustainability of debt. But we should make an effort, and the public institutions are called to make this effort. And as Giorgio said just a minute ago, we have been living in a long period of low interest rates and low inflation. So for most of advanced economies, the so-called snowball effect has been low or negative. And also we should mention that in 1919, Olivier Blanchard, a very influential economist, published a paper addressing the American Economic Association, saying that after all, public spending can be implemented without sizable effect on public debt and with very little fiscal cost, or maybe he was probably suggesting positive fiscal cost. But on the other hand, we have seen that uncertainty matters a lot. An example is that public debt has surged across all advanced economies, as Giorgio was saying. So why? We had these very favorable conditions in the markets, but at the same time, public debts have grown so much. And so, of course, the answer is that we had the financial crisis, we had the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, we have the pandemic crisis. Now we are witnessing another crisis, which is the war and the energy cost, the surging energy cost. So these events teach us that a simple comparison between averages of growth rates and interest rates over the long run may be very misleading. And in fact, I have to say that most of the experts who have contributed to this volume have a rather pessimistic view about the sustainability of debt, and in particular of the debt sustainability for Italy, Greece, and also France to some extent. For instance, Luger Schuknacht mentions various risks associated to high debt, and it goes that at least 8 EU countries, including Italy and France, are at sustainability risk. Martin Larch estimates that the Italian debt will most probably set around 160% of GDP by 2025. And Gabriellini, Nocella, and Padrini from the UPB, although they have slightly more optimistic view, and they place the Italian 2031 debt GDP ratio between 150 and 125%, although with great uncertainties. Then Van der Noord, also contributing to this volume, argues that the overall outlook is mixed. Greece and Italy, and to some extent France, must make large consolidations to converge to a debt limit. So overall, I would say that because we haven't seen yet a big increase in interest rates compared to the increase in inflation, the overall outlook for debt sustainability seems positive in the very short run, but very, very uncertain for the long run. Also because, at least for Italy, one of the problems is that we had a very poor performance in terms of GDP growth in the last 30 years at least, and the situation seems very risky for the future. So all these computations are certainly useful, but we all know that a sovereign debt crisis or default may occur at various levels of that GDP level. So for instance, the academic literature has introduced the notion of fiscal fatigue, which is one way of arguing that governments may be tempted to recur to extraordinary measures like capital levies or some kind of restructuring of public debt when there is political fragmentation, when there is populist pressures. We have seen things like that in the past. And the case of Italy is certainly under the spot because of the past experience. So in general, sovereign spreads reflect investors' expectations about solvency, as governments may have a temptation to default through a bankruptcy procedure or surprise inflation or capital levy. And this means that a large amount of public debt is risky. So the issue is not so much whether we are satisfying some sort of long-run transversality, as it's called in the academic literature, but very much about what level of debt GDP is compatible with political stability or in addition to financial stability. So what about these issues? Well, this in terms of the European situation. This volume is not only about Europe. There is also a very important contribution by Klein on the debt sustainability for emerging economies. But of course, Europe is central to this volume. So we all know that the European Monetary Union, so these issues of debt stability are very special, okay, and they need special consideration because of our situation in Europe. So we all know that the European Monetary Union was established under 4 important principles. One is the country's fiscal sovereignty, the no bailout clause, the absence of a sizable fiscal backstop by, a central fiscal capacity, and central bank independence. So all of these principles, when they're coupled with the relevant spillovers and externalities that exist among member countries, justify the existence of fiscal rules and in particular a cap on public debt. So maybe 60% of public debt is not the right measure, but we all recognize that some measure of, some limit on public debt must be enforced. After 20 years of European Monetary Union experience, it seems that the logic of these the EMU agreements is not working as expected. So I'm not going to talk about all of these issues because this will be, the issues that will be discussed in the roundtable. But I have to say that much of the contributions to this volume also discuss about the usefulness of repealing or revising some of the fiscal rules. So this is a central issue, also in light of the recent document issued by the European Commission. So what stand should we take on this? So I have to say that in general, there is this, so there are some of the contributions that advocate some relaxation of the fiscal rules, but not so much in terms of, so more on the targets, but at the same time, this relaxation of the rules, under some of the proposals that are, for instance, advocated by some the contributors, like, for instance, Romanelli, Tomasini, or Vadalà, and Baglioni and Bordignon, imply in some way a stronger commitments, a stronger influence of the European Commission on countries' policies, and additional limitations on the fiscal sovereignty of member countries. So these are all contentious issues. These are problems that I think are very important for the future. And in light of different perspectives, and one of them, and I'm concluding now, is the issue that I mentioned before, that this is the EU public goods problem. So externalities and spillovers are not limited to financial stability, but they are also connected to the possibility of the risk associated to the energy transition, the climate change, and also the war, because we all understand that probably Europe need some more expenditure on the side of public defense and military defense. So these are all questions that lead to a bigger question, which is, do we need extra space for these commitments, as for fiscal space for these commitments? Let me mention that Van der Noord, in his contribution to this volume, recalls that the European Commission predicts that annual green investment needed in the EU is about 1.5% of GDP annually, and 1% from the public purse. So the question is energy transition a reason for transferring the tax burden of future generations, for instance? So one issue is, yes, maybe, because future generation will benefit from the energy transition, but on the same time, we are leaving future generation more taxes to pay. Another thing that we should think about is whether we will be able to comply with the fiscal rules if there are these extra commitments. I have to say that Van der Noord favors the adoption of a green golden rule, which is something, again, that has been discussed very often, linked to the energy transition, and claims that this would not undermine long-run fiscal stability. And also, he proposes a European climate fund similar to the Next Generation EU. However, he also mentions the fact that there are asymmetries, and probably Northern European countries are the countries that need more effort in terms of abatement of polluting energies, so that differently from the EU, the Next Generation EU, in that case, probably there should be, a net transfers from the south to the north, as opposed to what happened in the case of the Next Generation EU. Okay, let me stop here. Okay, so as I said, there are many issues on the table, and I hope that we will enjoy reading this issue.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much. I don't know if it is. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I have the easy bit here, which is basically moderate the discussion. And I would like to invite our discussants to the table, because we don't have places for everybody. So please, and while you take seat, let me mention all the contributors, and I want to thank all of them because they have done a wonderful job. So besides myself and Pietro, we have Carmine Di Noi of the OECD, Lutger Schuknecht from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, who should be connected from Beijing, although it's pretty late over there. And he's a former chief economist of the German Finance Ministry. We have Bill Klein, Senior Emeritus Fellow of the Peterson Institute, should be connected from the US, and Giancarlo Corsetti of the European University Institute, Martin Larch of the European Fiscal Board. We have Cecilia Gabriellini, and Gianluigi Nocella, and Flavio Padrini from the UPB, the Parliamentary Budget Office. And we have Marzia Romanelli, Pietro Tommasino, Emilio Vaddalà of the Bank of Italy, Angelo Baglioni, Massimo Bordignon, and Paul Van der Noord of the Amsterdam University. Many of them are connected. I think Flavio Padrini should be here or should arrive soon. And with that, again, thanks to all of them. They have done a wonderful job. I think this volume of Economia Italiana is very, in my view, thought-provoking. And now here we are here not to present the papers, but to discuss the issues. And so we have a wonderful panel with distinguished guests. And my role is really to just moderate. But before that, let me just raise 4 issues which you are free to ignore, let's put it this way. First, I think it was already mentioned by Pietro that we might be close to a sort of shift in the paradigm. So, I mean, debt is an evergreen in Italy, but not only in Italy, unfortunately. But we might be at a turning point in a sense that the combination of long-term potential growth could change, and it's not yet clear whether for the better or for the worst. Okay, and at the same time, the equilibrium interest rates might be different, at least different from what we have seen over the past 15 years. So that might lead to a different equilibrium, so to speak. And financial markets might actually focus or think or re-estimate the kind of long-term equilibrium. And that might actually lead to bad equilibrium if that happens suddenly. So there is a risk really of a new paradigm, and that is an issue that we would like to raise for your discussion. Second issue is what should be the policy response, particularly on the fiscal side. We know that many countries, and including the emerging markets, as we have seen in the volume, are facing major challenges today, and there is a need, especially in Europe, for extra spending for projects that are perceived public goods. Not only the transition, the green transition, but also possibly some additional spending for defense, given what has happened in Ukraine. But there are many other issues that can be perceived as common goods in Europe, for which we need extra investment. So we need to make space for that effectively. And on top of that, we have to maintain a fiscal stance that is compatible with fiscal sustainability, which is very challenging in itself. So the second question is, what should be really the best policy in this environment? Third issue is about central banking. Many countries have faced, different kind of shocks, and central banks are reacting in slightly different ways. Okay, so despite we have a global spike in inflation, the underlying reason for that is quite different in many countries. Therefore, that requires also different responses by central banks. Now, central banks are in a difficult position as well, because they are doing their job to maintain price stability and maintain stability in expectations as well. But at the same time, they have to make sure that there is no so-called fiscal dominance. In other words, that they are not really dominated by the needs of the government to maintain stability. And at the same time, there is also a risk that by moving interest rates too quickly, they might undermine also financial stability. And so we have seen already, by the way, cracks in the global financial system, recently in the UK, but also in Korea, for instance. And that might lead signal that there might be some problems in the future. So how central banks will actually cope with that. Finally, and then I'll stop, I think that, we raised the issue of, the new potential paradigm, and then the issue of fiscal and monetary. But there is another issue which is very topical today, which is what are the fiscal rules that are fit for the purpose, that are up to the task of providing a guideline and a proper incentive for governments to maintain fiscal discipline and maintain sustainability for public finances. I think I'll stop here. We have a wonderful panel, and I will start in the order that is in the program. And we have first Pier Padoan. Everybody knows him, so there's no need for presentation. He's now chairman of UniCredit and former economy and finance minister. So you're free to maybe stand up if you want, or sit down, and as you prefer.
Okay.
Please. No. It's not compulsory. It's totally up to you.
Okay, just a quick meeting to decide that.
Okay.
As long as the mic works.
You have to be closer to that.
Can you hear me? Down there. Last row. Okay, thank you very much. Well, thanks very much for this invitation, and thanks very much for this opportunity. While I'm not thanking Lorenzo for making an introduction, because I wanted to say exactly the same things that he said. So I'm running out of topics now. We all know that sustainability hangs upon two variables, the interest rate and the growth rate, plus the primary surplus if needed, which comes in and out depending on where you are in the cycle. These are the same variables, but you can have very different stories and values according to the context in which you put these variables. So I will continue to kick off the conversation by offering you my own list of context-making assumptions where we should put the interest rate and the growth rate to check whether Blanchard's optimism was well placed or not. So I have 3 rather than 4 questions, and let me repeat them, and I'll try to offer some hints for answering them. First question, where does long-run growth come from? Don't answer, just think about it. Second, how should EMU architecture be modified to take into account of the new monetary environment and fiscal? Third point, how will financial markets react? This is something which has not been given enough attention. After all, think of the scenario. Once we are out of the current of the policy paradigm we've been in for a few years, markets will have to find ways to reprice their investment in ways which simply we do not know about. But this is just to tell you why I put this as a third challenge. So let me try to answer quickly to my 3 questions and pick up the suggestions offered by Lorenzo. Growth. Growth has been the painstaking problem of the Italian economy for decades. We all know why there's no growth, because there's no productivity, of course, which begs the question why there's no productivity growth, which is much more complicated than growth alone. Let me just mention one thing, that we now have in Italy, since Italy has been mentioned explicitly, a growth instrument, which is out there, out our door, which is NPRR instrument, which is something, in my view, could be very well taken as a full-size program for the government, don't quote me. Just implement the NPRR and that you will have the best economic program for years in this country. Because I believe that the potential of the NPRR is extremely high and valuable, and we still haven't made up our minds on how to exploit it. So growth. Growth can come in terms of exploiting one element, which again is not in the debate, but which is justified by a look at economic history, which is the fact that we are living through a technological revolution. We are living in a situation in which, to some effect, we can compare the state of the technological economy today to the times in which electricity was invented, so to speak, and introduced. Why am I saying this? Because there are potential sources of much higher productivity that can be exploited. Some of you who may be familiar with that literature know that Robert Gordon, many years ago, wrote a very important paper saying that the productivity growth in the United States was simply fading away, and the world would be doomed to be in a steady state, still situation for the rest of the time. I don't believe this is true, and I believe the contrary, exactly for what one sees around visiting maybe companies or looking at industrial economy reports rather than macroeconomic reports. They never do one, they always do separate reports. The Next Generation EU has a strong potential. It could deliver growth, and it can do so by policy instruments which are at our disposal: public investment, structural reforms, and the third instrument, which again is not mentioned, which is generating the appropriate incentives for private capital, which is badly needed, because as was just recalled by Lorenzo, we will need a lot of private investment to fill the gap, which public investment will not be able to do so. So there is a big chance, let me anticipate one conclusion, which Italy must exploit. That's my first point. You can extend that point to other countries, but it's not obvious that they will do better than we do. For instance, I was talking to a senior Spanish policy official the other day, and he told me that contrary to what you read in the press, the Spanish situation in terms of exploiting the NPRR there, Spain is the second next beneficiary of the funds, is absolutely way back. So we are ahead, believe it or not, in implementing a major policy opportunity. So growth will come. We'll have the right composition in terms of the green transition and the digital transition only if we implement what we have promised to the European authorities, and with the money which is already available. So what else can you get? First point. So putting in context the debt sustainability problem of Italy, which has always been there since we were kids and going to school, is to realize that this is an opportunity in a lifetime for Italian reasons, European reasons, global reasons. There is I don't want to sound too optimistic, but this is what I think, I believe. Second point, I'm already taking too much time. What do we do with EMU architecture? Well, EMU architecture beyond the Stability and Growth Pact reform, which I believe is needed at the margin, needs a major change or addition, right, rather than change. We need essential fiscal capacity, not because we like fiscal capacities, but because I think, and this is the second point I offer to conversation, that even if we implement the NPRR, we end up in a situation in which potential output will not be filled by demand's contribution, which is large enough to avoid output gaps. So we run the risk of building up a potential economy machine, which, however, will need an additional demand impulse to be exploited. How do you do that? Through one of the functions which in the central fiscal capacity debate is assigned, which is the production of public or European public goods, which Lorenzo and Pietro mentioned. So how do we change the architecture in a way that allows the contribution of national policies and European policies to produce public goods? And we need public goods, not only because we want to grow more, but because the policy priorities globally have changed in terms of security, in terms of technology, in terms of defense. And we simply cannot do without those public goods. Otherwise, globally, we will be discussing the G2 next year, not the G3, the G2, meaning China and the United States, because Europe will be irrelevant. So second point, EMU architecture needs to be strengthened, and this will reverberate positively on the growth rate, although it might reverberate to some extent on the interest rate. But it will make the growth rate more credible because it will provide the European policymaking with additional resources and tools, and this will impact on long-term expectations. Third point, financial markets. But financial markets are really a mystery because we have shifted in a few weeks' time from a zero or negative interest rates structure to a positive interest rate structure, which is still to be assessed and allocated. We still don't know which will be the levels of the interest rate curves, let me use this term, in the future. But this is related to a point which I mentioned already, let me repeat it. What are financial markets pricing? Where do they find risk opportunities to be exploited? We don't know in a new environment what happens, but certainly this is possibly the most challenging situation and policy choice of the ones I mentioned. We already are discussing about how we would like to reform the SGP. We are already discussing about how to build a common fiscal capacity. What do we know about policy and financial policy for the post-zero-bound economy, let me call it that way? We know very little, at least I know very little, because the behavior will be changed. And if the behavior will be changed, what will happen to the market rate, which will be needed to check the Y less R identity, which allows for sustainable growth to be available. So I have questions, but what we are, and I have only few answers. Let me add one final element, which has to do with, which is not a new element. It's actually a very old element of the European policy debate, which is still very much present today, which is the distinction between risk sharing and risk mitigation. At the end of the day, in Europe, in order to produce public goods, we need risk sharing. Risk sharing not being a magic formula, but being a policy attitude. And I am concerned, not so much of the fact that we are going back to higher interest rates. I'm concerned with the fact that risk sharing, which was very much on the under the spotlight with Next Generation EU, now it's being thrown back in the back seat. We are again looking at internal conflicts within Europe, which are very old but still very present. I fully understand the position of the bad guys, I mean the northern hawkish countries, because of the fact that we in the south may disappoint them once again. But what do you know? If we bring home the Next Generation EU, at least in Italy, we would get a double shot, more growth and more confidence. So we could actually hope that Europe can find a way to make progress. And we will have that sustainability Mark II. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's fascinating discussion on this topic. Next on my list, I have Roel Beetsma from it's the Dean of the Department of Economics of the Amsterdam University and also member of the European Fiscal Board. I can see him connected online, and so Roel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you for having me. I wish I could have been in Rome, but I cannot split myself, and unfortunately, there are also management duties that prevent me from traveling too much. I want to make a couple of points, and I think these, they relate very much to what Carlo was saying. I want to talk about debt sustainability and the potential revision of the SGP rules, and I want to say a few things about how to boost investment, reform, and so following up on the discussion about the recovery plans and also I think the discussion of the EU public goods. So, when it comes to public debt, I think that I see two things that are, in my view, important and remarkable, and that is first, and that was already discussed by Carlo, that how fast things can change, because we moved from a situation in which there was, especially early during the pandemic, a potential threat of deflation, very low interest rates, and in a very brief amount of time, the situation completely changed. That started with Corona, and then there was the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis. So it's remarkable how fast things can change, and we could not have imagined that a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when there was the famous work by Blanchard and also with others, explaining that the capacity for higher debt was there, and basically it would be, in a way, you could raise the debt to a very large extent without much risk. So that is something that I think, in my view, that pleads in favor of very careful policies, also when interest rates are very low, to be careful not to let debt increase too much. Now, the second is that even though interest rates go up, borrowing costs go up, but of course, this is not something, the borrowing costs go up, but since the debt maturities have been lengthened, that those higher borrowing costs, they affect the public budget with a delay, and that is, of course, it's beneficial. But then, on the other hand, we know that it could also be self-fulfilling crisis, and that means that even though the borrowing costs may not increase a lot now, you know, there is a potential danger of self-fulfilling crisis, even though it is, of course, not a very high likelihood. But if investors expect these costs to go up too much, even in the future, if growth is very low and there's no perspective of higher growth, then you could get a self-fulfilling dynamics, which again, it's not very likely, fortunately, but still there's always a danger. And we've seen that with the UK a couple of weeks ago, how you know, how quickly markets can get into a panic. Now, we think as European Fiscal Board, and we said that several times, it's important to go back to the rules quickly. But we also need to go back to a revised set of rules for which we gave leads. We made suggestions. Now the European Commission has come up with, I think on the 9th of November it came up with its proposals, which of course it's, and I will say a few words about this, but of course these are, you know, in a way headline proposals that need to be worked out further. I think there is, and as European Fiscal Board, we have not yet discussed the proposals in a lot of depth, but I think there are a couple of elements that are potentially promising. So one element is that the European Commission itself will put forward a multi-annual path for the net primary expenditures. And that will be a reference path. And then the member state will submit its fiscal structural plan. And that would be, so the path that is proposed by the Commission would be some minimum path in terms of how debt will develop. And then the member state submits its fiscal structural plan, which will then be assessed by the Commission and should be endorsed by the Council. Now, so there is an incentive, and I think a couple of elements are promising. One is that these concern fiscal structural plans, and so there is also the investment and the structural reform. It's part of the plan, and coming back to what was said earlier. I think that attempts to reduce debt should go together, of course, with measures to increase potential growth rate. Otherwise, it will become very, very difficult. I think one promising element is, of course, that it is up to the member state itself to come up with a plan. So I think the ownership of the plan would be higher than when a plan is superimposed. National independent fiscal institutions will have a role to assess the plans, and I think that is also important because they have more information on their own country. But of course, there are also a number of unanswered questions. So, how do we calculate an expenditure path that is consistent with a certain trajectory for the public debt? During the reference period of 4 years, debt may not have to decrease already, which in my view would be risky in the sense that I think it's crucial to show basically through actions by reducing the public debt, even if it is only very gradually, you show a commitment to sustainability. Other question is, suppose that the reforms and the investments do not, work out as expected. What does that mean for the path? And so there are a number of questions that, of course, still need to be answered. And of course, the plans need to be worked out, or the proposals need to be worked out further. But I think overall, I see this as a positive step. Now, I think that, and here coming back, I wanted to say something on reforms and investment. And I think the recovery, so the next generation EU is a good step, but it's also in terms, and of course, the contribution differs per country. So it's bigger for Italy and well, less for Spain, but then bigger than for some other countries. Overall, at the European level, it's still not very substantial. But of course, Italy will benefit more. But I think that, Lorenzo and Paul, some time ago, we wrote a Fox EU article saying that, well, I mean, these plans are, I mean, they're beneficial, but they're also somewhat, coincidental configuration of the decisions at the country level, and they are not, they're not connected. And I think what will be crucial is that we have at the European level those EU public goods that have spillovers across countries. So like infrastructures, for example, hydrogen infrastructures, but also electricity grids, high-speed railways, etc., etc. I think this will be crucial to have, to have maybe an enlarged EU budget, but focused on these type of expenditures that have spillovers across countries. So more countries will benefit, and I think it's necessary to have these. I would not use the fiscal rules to make exceptions for investments, etc. I think it has to go through the central EU budget. One could also think, and this is something that we proposed as European Fiscal Board, one could think that about envelopes for individual countries, where there is some allocation of resources that they can spend on investments and reforms, and preferably together with other countries in order to generate these spillovers. But if they do not spend it, the money will go to the EU budget, and then it will be for everyone. So these are my points, and let me hand back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Roel, for your very thought-provoking considerations. Next on my list, I have Maria Cannata, who is now advisor to the Ministry of Economy and Finance, but we all know that she has been for many, many years in charge of the Italian debt, so certainly she has something to say about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Some of the reflection that I wanted to tell have been already done by the previous speaker. So I will be less organic than the Pier Carlo intervention, for example. Nevertheless, I found the contribution to this volume very interesting, and what I wanted to tell at the very beginning, to take some idea from the Martin Larch contribution, in particular because it is quite an ideal premises of all the discussion, because I found there are two elements particularly important to go ahead with the discussion. First of all, an observation that the first is that it is very difficult to individuate a precise ceiling valuable in any context, in any time period for different kind of countries in terms of debt to GDP ratio, public debt to GDP ratio. There are in this paper some example where in some cases 26% was considered enough to be unsustainable, while the opposite is the Japan with 260%, is not causing concern in the market participants regarding the capacity of repay the debt. Because what the market is carrying at master is the confidence, the trust that sooner or later, even in long time, the debt will be repaid punctually, and also there is the capacity of sovereign countries to provide themselves the resources for doing it. This is the almost unique concern of market participants. And this also explains why there has been such a big movement, reaction to the novelties in the UK policy, and that was corrected very, very rush, and some recovery goes back. And this is also one of the reasons that explain why for Italy is so difficult to obtain the same benefit and the same result than other countries received, a similar country like Spain or Portugal that have benefited much more than Italy of the very low cost of financing during the last few years. It is quite impressive noticing the distance between Italy rates and Portuguese or Spanish one. So it is, and my opinion is not justified by the starting point of a higher debt to GDP level. It is something that maybe is also consequence of the very low growth recorded in the past 20 years, while other countries showed some more dynamism, even if not a particular virtuous behavior, but more regular consistency in their attempts. Maybe Italy is suffering to an excess of volatility in the political world, and too much changes in the approach of the problems that have not leaving the time to market participants to be confident in some continual paths. Another interesting suggestion is coming from the proposal, very concrete proposal that are in the paper of Romanelli, Tomasino, Vadalà. They are trying to find a mix of new measures in defining the new rules for recovering to the Stability Pact that in part are very similar to those that have been just proposed by the EU Commission. But what I found there particularly interesting is the seek of simplicity, because one of the problems in the previous mechanism was a too complex mix of parameters, indicators, and some of them were moreover estimation and not observed data. That I believe that it is very important to go back in the reintroduction of the Stability Pact using simple and observable data. This is very important in my opinion. In their paper, they suggest to have an anchor in particular to the level of the debt. And for the rest, there are different solution illustrated Some is more related, make more stringent reference to the deficit as before. And others are speaking about the expenditures. But what expenditure? The global expenditures, the primary expenditures, because for sure there is some difference, because the interest expenditures are not in the hand of the government, are more in the market perception. Only indirectly they are influenced by the government decisions. For that, for having an efficiency on that, there is also need to replicate a mechanism of European facilities for selected areas. For example, to help the country to overcome macroeconomic shocks, not in every case, and moreover applying it in a tailor-made with a dialogue between the Italian policymaker, the national policymaker, and the Commission, to take into account the starting point and defining a pluriannual path for that. This could be really efficient because on one side, if well managed also in terms of communication to the single people in every country and with the Commission, to allow to tell we are defining together with the European authority the policy with benefits that will have a positive effect, first of all, in the specific country, but with the benefit everywhere. But for that, it is really necessary a climate of confidence, of trust. And this, I believe, is the most complex aspect, because, you know, this is probably the less easy result. But without such a combination of taking into account in some way the starting point and the specific situation of an economy in a country, and dialing profitably, is very difficult to obtain something that is really working. Just a last brief comment regarding the fact that the proposal of considering in particular specific rules or target regarding the expenditure on the environment, especially against the change of climate and so on. I believe that I don't know if it is the moment to do it, but for sure a greater attention to this type of problem is absolutely essential. Because the negative effect, tragical effect some way, of pollution, climate change, management of the territory are becoming more and more relevant also in economic terms, in terms of cost, and without it is very difficult to progress. And in the Italian budget, there are a lot of expenditure addressed to this purpose. Maybe it could be less difficult than one at the beginning can imagine to also accomplish this set of rules also for our country. with the recovery plan and also the issuance of a green bond, the public administration is going more and more in depth in verifying the correct usage of the expenditure, the addressed usage of that, and the evaluation, the assessment of the impact that they have. This work has started, and it will advance even in the next future. And I believe that this can contribute to have also more effectiveness in the public expenditures. Because I noticed that the level of public expenditure in Italy is not so distant from what of many other peers in Europe, but the fact that we have not grown is quite an evidence that the expenditure has not been effective. I stop here because I...
Thank you, Maria. Next on my list is Andrea Montanino from Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, and before that, many other positions. So over to you, please.
Thank you, Lorenzo. It was really a pleasure to see many friends tonight. We talk so far about ourselves, about Europe, about Italy, but when we talk about debt sustainability, I think at the current juncture, we need to differentiate and look also at the other side of the world. So emerging markets, developing countries. I will talk about Europe and Italy, but let me say that we have a short-term issue and a medium to long-term issue. In the short term, we need to look at emerging and developing countries. And for this group of countries, there are a number of elements that worries me and bring me to say that we have not to rethink debt sustainability for them. Debt sustainability is the main thing we have to look at, as it was before and as it will be in the future. But what worries me now, first, the strong dollar is causing an outflow of foreign currency, foreign capitals. And there are two G20 countries like Argentina and Turkey that are particularly vulnerable because of because a great part of their debt is dollar denominated. Second element that worries me is the increasing interest rates. That is not just something that we see in advanced economies. This will reduce the budget room to counterbalance the economic slowdown, which, given, by the way, the characteristic of inflation and how inflation is hitting now, it is hitting mainly the most vulnerable. And then the third element that worries me in the short term is that if debt sustainability becomes an issue, this will prevent the IMF to provide financial assistance. Because financial assistance by the IMF is provided if countries are able to show that they are sustainable in the medium term, unless they have to do debt restructuring. So today there are 90 countries in the world that are under a financial program by the IMF. 90 countries means half of the world. Okay, so it's not a small thing. So I think, of course, I like the volume, I like all the papers, but probably having a little bit more attention, say, on the other side of the world, not just us or advanced economy, would have been beneficial. Maybe it's a matter for next volume of Economia Italiana. Then look at the medium term, look at Europe and advanced economies. So in the EU, debt sustainability has 20 years. exactly 20 years ago, in 2002, the Commission started to think how to measure long-term sustainability. I was a young economist at that time, and I was asked to write down a sort of a model to measure long-term sustainability. I did my duty. By the way, I think it's still the same way we did 20 years ago, how the European Commission measure sustainability of debt. But the main concern at that time was to find out a number that could provide a guidance for member states in terms of the primary surplus. So the whole exercise was to say which is the primary surplus that the country has to run in order to have a sustainable debt trajectory. Now the world is different, and now the question is whether debt sustainability is still an issue, given especially the role of the ECB in the last years. And I would say yes for two reasons. The first is that the ECB stance can change, especially in purchasing public debt. Just to give you a number that I suppose Maria knows very well, but in 2012, the Italian public debt owned by the ECB was less than 5% of the total public debt. Today is more than 25%. Okay, so this is what happened in the last, say, 10 years. Good, but we don't know what will happen in the next 10 years. So things can change, and therefore, not just for Italy, the need for refinancing debt on the market can be extremely relevant. The second reason why I think is still relevant talking about debt sustainability in Europe is that long-term sustainability of economic systems is getting more and more relevance among investors. It's climate change, it's social issues, it's energy transition. All these affect sustainability, including public debt path. So an holistic approach by markets now prevails, and public debt is part of this equation. So we have to look at public debt because investors look at long-term sustainability of economies, not just of public debt. So what? Is the Commission proposal on the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact going in the right direction? I think this is something that will be debated a lot in the coming month, but I would say yes in principle, because it considered debt sustainability as a multifaceted issue. It's not just a primary surplus issue, as it was 20 years ago, 15 years ago. It's positive the distinction of among countries in three different groups in terms of debt to GDP level. Is not a novelty. It was already there for many years, but okay. I think it's positive to better include into the analysis the contribution of investment and reforms in order to provide that sustainability. But the two big question marks are still on the table. And the two big question marks on the Stability and Growth Pact for the last, I would say, 25 years has been enforcement and procedures. And in the reform of in the proposal by the Commission, these two elements, enforcement and rules and procedures, are still problematic. Enforcement is the usual language to me, and process and procedure are even more complicated than in the past, will be even more complicated. And so there is a missing part in the proposal, which is what Carlo said before. And the missing part is the common European fiscal capacity. So my feeling is that the Commission is trying to work through the Stability and Growth Pact because they believe there will not be a political consensus to do something different. And so it's the usual thing we did in 2003, we did in 2009, 10, I don't remember the other reform of the pact, we did with the sixth pact, and so it's always trying to work through the Stability and Growth Pact because there is no political agreement to do something different. So probably in the discussion in the coming month will be interesting to see whether, and I'm going to finish, whether someone will put on the table a proposal that goes in this way. Let's make countries' debt sustainability even more rigid, but allow more flexibility at European level to finance what we have said is needed. So in other words, I don't know whether it's possible, whether it's politically viable, and how to build it. But if we increase fiscal capacity at EU level, we can reduce the margin of maneuver of member states, simply because some of the investment can be done at EU level, not at national level. And stop here.
Thank you very much. And next on my list is Cosimo Pacciani from Poste Italiane, and before that, ESM, so plenty of experience on that as well. Please.
Thank you very much, and very happy and honored to be here because around this table, a lot of people are doing the years in which, even before when I was in London at Royal Bank of Scotland, I always look as templates and say examples for the way in which they've been able during the years to convince us that, especially in Italian, that history was sustainable and strong. So thank you very much for having me today to talk to you. Yeah, my past experience as a chief fiscal officer, I think will allow me today to say maybe something also is if I'm looking and reading this paper, this book or the publication, trying to answer a simple question. Am I convinced that going forward, they have a history of debt sustainability at global, European, Italian level, or there are concerns that are becoming even larger and more evident and something to start to be even more concerned about? Because it's clear in front of everybody that we are not in front of, let's say, especially in the last 3-4 years, as we were recovering from the big financial crisis, we found ourselves immersed in what I define nowadays as singularity or a series of singularities or events that have been so wide and global and devastating that they change completely also the way in which we look at companies, at the government spending, but also at more granular levels of our lives, because I think the change has been dramatic. This has been compounded by the two big transitions that were the first purpose through which the European Commission was trying to launch Next Generation, that was, oversighted by the pandemic. So they had to create also an additional series of programs. And I think obviously the technological digital transition and climate change. I was reading this morning somewhere something, I will come back to that later, talk about public funding and requirements. I was reading about what happened in Ischia, and somebody was comparing the 450 kilometers of coast that Netherlands has to protect daily to the 7,500 kilometers of coastal lines of Italy, of which 53% are floodplains or are subject to flooding, or could be subject to flooding. So if you look from, from what we are trying to look, when we look at the sustainability and the challenges we have ahead of us, this is quite a big, mismatch. But anyway, so I think from reading the publication, I have some, some narrative, and I would like to provide you some points, hopefully for discussion, even now after, that really struck me. One is the concept, as reading the publication, a concept of mismatch. It is not expressed clearly there, but I think there is a clear evidence that at the moment we are in a specific element in which we have a series of mismatch. For example, if you look at the stock of debt that we have, the short-term debt that we have to refinance also in the coming years, and the maturity is coming for maturity at global level, but also at a more regional level in other countries. There is for sure, there's an element there to look at how then you're able to extend the maturities or to extend the duration of the debt over time. There is an element of mismatch, I think, is coming around, or mismatch, or let's say disconnectedness that appeared in some moments around some of the fiscal, European fiscal, also monetary policies was an element, obviously, of potential policy errors or mistakes that not in Europe, but all across, they had a much bigger impact. Thinking about the case of the United Kingdom, in which the government decision brought back the Bank of England to reconsider the quantitative tightening programs, etc. So there's another element there to consider, that because of the exceptional moments that we're living, it looks like we're also in a process of trial and error sometimes in order to address some of the issues, because we have this kind of trade-offs between growth, inflation, and rising rates. And this is not something that will disappear over time, and maybe it's something that we should start even focusing more attention on, how then we are able to close some of these gaps, also gaps of, let's say, of perception sometimes, because I'm sure that in the right places, it's also my experience, the right decisions are taken, but then it's also sometimes an issue how to communicate it to the markets and to the investors, also to the citizens. Another element that I found in a book on a publication interesting is that we are looking at another moment, focusing on Europe. We're looking at the moment in which we have to increase a series of spending that we're not used to increase anymore. Like thinking about defense spending is one element of security at different levels. Just this week, the ECB pretty much remember everybody the rising cost of cybersecurity. It will become bigger and bigger. So there are a series of specialized capacity of funding specific purposes that is growing over time. So it's not only about climate change or the transition to a more digitalized future, but it's also the fact there are more contingencies and risks that we need to monitor and cater for, and there are additional costs we didn't have only a few years ago. On the paper, also appreciated, there's quite a lot of emphasis on the book. There's a lot of emphasis on mounting problem of debt by corporates. Is another element of let's say concern, of attention, because this is again is linked to the capacity of the corporates that they have to refinance themselves. It's also linked to their own capacity to thrive in growing economies and growing demand. At the moment, obviously, we are all looking at what is going to happen around that one. Even before the pandemic crisis, we started talking about zombie companies, zombie corporates, and I think the topic is coming back now after this moment of hiatus in which most of the small and medium enterprises or companies being heavily supported, like also the families and citizens by the governments. But this is an aspect of the funding or the support that may start to wane, and then we need to see where we're left with. Also, because associated to that, this was a continuous, and I think that's why I was talking about singularity before, because there was a continuous technological advancement even faster during the last 3-4 years that maybe made some players be more obsolete than we expected. So I think the zombie companies element will maybe even increase over time. Then there is another interesting aspect, and translating to, let's say, a risk management point, is the fact that until now we've been used to public debt was mostly for general corporate purposes, where from what also some of the other panelists say, we see the emerging need or requirement to start to channel funds to more specific targets. It was really the case before, but now even more, or at least also not only in terms of deploying the capacity of the government to spend, but also now in terms of addressing or presenting the products, the bonds or the financing to the markets, because we talk about ESG, sustainability index bonds, etc. And this is something, and also the ECB started talking about green QE, pretty much started making some, let's call it, I don't know if you call it adverse or optimal selection, obviously, but there is a theme here that we're moving from a general purpose, even on the public debt, so much more selected channel. This leaves you with the problem of the stock of debt that we have, the one I was referring before, in terms that need to be refinanced, restructured, it's the word, not restructured, but refinanced or reprogrammed in order to address some of the issues that have been flagged also before. Then I also appreciated on a publication the emphasis on emerging markets because, well, it was a paper by William Klein, I think really tells the story of this potential debt caldera, was also mentioned by Dr. Montanino, which is sitting though in countries with completely different dynamics from a demographic and also from a social or potential point of view. I compare it like modeling with clay and carving a stone made of marble is quite a difference. And clay, you can remodel it. Marble is a bit more difficult to do it. And so when I look at the advanced economies, debt, it looks to me like something more complex to manage than what is happening on emerging economies. Although I think obviously there are issues there, and I appreciated the paper because it's very interesting from that point of view. From a risk management point of view, what I have on the narrative of the book, I also like the emphasis on execution. Also, Professor Padoan was mentioning before the fact that there is an emphasis on a capacity to deliver what I call it the last mile of the funding. So the capacity to have not only the right programs in place, to have the right channels in which you can fund the right appetite in the market, but then in a lot of countries, and I lived this through my experience at DSM not in Italy, obviously, but in other countries in Europe, in a Eurozone, is capacity of execution. So to find a way in which you have not only the funding, but also the capacity where to invest, how to invest, and also often more and more the right skills to do it, because there is also huge scarcity. So whatever is your program, then also you need to have the right capacity in terms of human capacity or potential to deploy. But also, I agree with Professor Padoan, I think for me, the Italian recovery plan is really a huge opportunity for the country. It's equivalent to a program with less burdens, but at the same time, hopefully with the same capacity and impact. And another element is always a recurring on a publication is quite regularly coming back on the debates about the sustainability, is demographics. We spoke a lot about it, it's been written a lot. I think there is an element for me that is not only the demographics in general, so the aging population and also the capacity of the economy to generate enough human capital to be able to replace the old one and then to continue to thrive. But it's also the distribution of wealth around the demographic space. So wealth is sitting at the moment and now it's being transmitted, let's put it this way, to the newer generations. Could be in form of wealth, could be in form of assets, or also in form often of knowledge. So there's another element, I think, to cut it also because there's an impact on the capacity of the countries to generate growth and wealth. So from that point of view, I think, I don't want to take more of your time. I think that the book is a very interesting narrative, which is telling us that, yes, we are at a singularity junction. We are going through this difficult moment at the same time. And we also, I think it shows there is a capacity to look through the cycle, or to look this period, because we already have institutions or the capacity we demonstrated during the pandemic, even now, during the war crisis, the capacity in Europe to invent new tools and new solutions. I was working for DSM and it was created, let's say, in a space where there was nothing. I could define the DSM synthetic fiscal space, because to some extent the sense of the funding done through DSM is pretty much built on the support of all the member states, both the FSF and ESM. And I think there is an element of friction, but also of resolution on how the monetary fiscal policy will keep dialoguing. And at this crucial point, I think the focus on environmental social sustainability across Europe is there, and I think is where the growth will come from. So as now we're going through this huge exercise to be sure that that's sustainable, at the same time, we hope that the investments that we are making will become more fruitful and useful for the growth history and also for the wealth of the European citizens. And also there is an element is that another part of the reform is the completion of all the different market reforms that were waited to be completed for the capital markets, the banking union, the deposit insurance scheme, because there will close the gap. It will allow a real functioning of the European mechanism, and is where I think is where we are running a risk on that. So talking in terms of public common good, I also appreciated the part devoted to that in the book, so that we hope we will avoid the risk of to move from a public common good to debt becoming a public common burden. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. And last but not least, we have Daniel Gros, who everybody knows is from the CEPS in Brussels. And so we have a tendency to finish up with fireworks. So we have high expectations.
Thanks a lot. You forgot to mention that I'm not just from CEPS, but also from Louis, because I'm visiting this university.
Sure.
So I should be very careful before putting the house on fire. Let me try to develop the one concept which Cosimo mentioned, namely risk. And risk for me is a combination of two issues: uncertainty and non-linearities or convexities. That we have uncertainty, I think everybody has emphasized. That was also implicit in the question, the first question you asked, Lorenzo, do we have a paradigm shift? But I think the word paradigm shift also already includes another element of uncertainty, namely what I would call fat tails, right? It's not just a little bit up or a little bit down, but could we move to a different world, right? And we have moved from one world to another in terms of interest rates, as we already mentioned. Then we have been, Europe have been hit twice, right? First COVID and then war and energy, one in a century crisis. Maybe we should up our estimate of the probability of one in a century crisis, right? And so that's something we should keep in mind. But if you deal only in linear variables, linear systems, then uncertainty can be very large, but you can concentrate on the average. But I would argue that especially in the area of public debt, you have very strong non-linearities. And that a little bit of higher debt can mean a much higher cost to society. I'm not talking so much of a sharp borderline between sustainable and non-sustainable, but I'm talking about something which certainly the market people here know, which is a simple fact of life regularity, that the risk premium of a country usually increases with the debt to GDP ratio. This is not a relationship that has a stable coefficient, but you can take, I bet you, the cross-section of euro area countries and the risk premium they're paying, and you will find for almost every month or every day a strong relationship between the debt level and the risk premium paid by the country. Sometimes the relationship is stronger, sometimes it's weaker, but it's almost always there. And that simple relationship has a very simple implication. It means that the overall interest rate cost, which is the product of the interest rate you pay times the debt, is convex, right? It's quadratic if you have a simple linear relationship. And that means that, as I said earlier, doubling your debt level doesn't double your costs. It quadruples your costs, potentially, right? And that is, I think, the key issue which one should keep in mind when one combines that with uncertainty. If you have a very high debt ratio already, then also the difference between the marginal cost of debt and the interest rate becomes very large, right? If the interest rate cost is quadratic, you have a very large difference between the interest rate, which is now whatever 4-point-something%, and the marginal cost of debt. Because you increase your debt a little bit, you get a higher risk premium, and your total interest rate expenditure goes up by more. So the marginal cost of debt is much higher than the average that you see in terms of the interest rate. And that implies if you have a very high uncertainty, especially if you have fat tails, right? Convexity plus fat tails means trouble, right? There's a small chance that you get a very big cost for your society. I think the euro area crisis was, if you want, one example, and then Italy got saved twice now with the pandemic and the Ukraine problems. But I think if one keeps that into account, one should go away from this issue of is it sustainable at this R minus G or not. The R minus G is one variable, but it is not the decisive variable. There's this famous paper by Paolo Mauro, R minus G is negative, can we sleep soundly? And he finds that actually you have the same frequency of default in areas when you have R minus G in the sense of the riskless rate minus the growth rate being negative. Right? Because after a while, when you accumulate enough debt, this curvature sets in, and then you can get fried. This is not necessarily the self-fulfilling attacks which everybody talks about, when in a couple of weeks maybe you can no longer refinance your debt. This is a slowly developing curve over years and maybe even decades. And unfortunately, Italy has been sitting on the wrong part of that curve for very long. And this is also an area where actually you cannot have only negative spirals, but also positive spirals. And here I would disagree with you. I think Portugal is a case in very easy or straightforward case of a positive spiral. Portugal had for a long time a debt ratio like Italy and was paying a higher or slightly higher risk premium. And then a government comes which says, we are absolutely against austerity. And they reduce the deficit. They reduce it in an inefficient way, first cutting investment and so on, but they reduce the deficit. And after a while, financial markets take note. And now they're on the way down. And they have, I think, the difference between Italy and Portugal, 7 years after the start of the government policy, is 30 basis points. Italy 150, Portugal 120. And therefore, the much lower risk premium which Portugal now pays, in my view, is justified. So my view is this convexity means big risk, but it also means big reward from acting decisively, getting you on a better trajectory. And I think the reward you get from getting yourself on a better trajectory is not only that you get this downward spiral as Portugal, but also the next time around, the next time the 1 in a 100 years shock comes around, you are in a much better place, right? You can react, the government, can fulfill its function. And I think this is the key issue which should preoccupy us. We are living in an area of extremely high uncertainty. We have this convexity, and the first task of economic policy should be to get the spiral downwards in terms of debt, so that next time around Italy is prepared. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think we are still under general escape clause, so we can overrun a little bit, right? But I think there are many people on the audience that I would like to kind of provoke, but there's one in particular. So we have, the privilege to have with us Beetsma from Moody's, and also Greg Kiss, by the way. So it's not an obligation, but if you want to comment, the podium is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Lorenzo. Thanks for being here. Very good discussion. I mean, just two remarks maybe. I mean, one is on debt to GDP, where in a way demystifying debt to GDP, because if you look at the econometric literature, debt to GDP is quite weak in predicting defaults of governments. Typically, many governments defaulted at 30% debt to GDP, and others can sustain 200 or really very high numbers. And in terms of at Moody's, we're looking at it in the lens of our sovereign methodology. and their debt to GDP is an important indicator. But we assess debt to GDP on the one hand and interest payment to revenue, which is also very important, debt affordability, on the basis of our assessment of economic and institutional strengths. So we have Maria knows that very well. So we have 4 rating factors at Moody's. We have economic strengths, institutional strengths, fiscal strengths, and susceptibility to event risk. And when we look at the fiscal strengths, we assess it on the basis of economic and institutional strengths. And if you are a country with low economic strengths and low institutional strengths, say a frontier market in Africa or so, then you have a very low economic and institutional strengths, and even a low debt to GDP number causes big problems. And on the other hand, if you are the United States or Germany or other advanced economies, and you have very significant economic institutional strengths, you can support much higher debt to GDP numbers. But I also agree that within the euro area, debt to GDP is actually quite telling. And the reason is that we have a relative homogeneous group of countries. So here, debt to GDP really makes a difference. But the big thing really is, if we look at global sovereigns, to look at debt to GDP on the basis of economic and institutional strength. So that's my first comment. The other one is, and I mean, it's really a very insightful volume. And Lorenzo, when I read your paper there, I really thought that's precisely how we see it at Moody's at the moment. Because when you look at, I mean, we are a succession of crises over the past years. And interestingly enough, I mean, the pandemic crisis was a crisis that hit economic activity extremely forceful, and with these huge contractions, and government stepped in and debt to GDP shot up again. And in a way, at first sight, the energy crisis and the geopolitical crisis now is in the first instance less severe. But we see it completely different. So at least for the advanced economies in Europe, at the time of the pandemic, we didn't do any rating actions in Europe. I mean, the only one we did was Malta, but that was very country specific. We assigned a negative outlook on the A2 rating there, but we kept all the other outlooks stable and didn't move ratings, because our assessment was the pandemic is a one-off, and advanced economies can look through the stress there, and we come out unscathed on the other side of the crisis. And also in terms of the policy measures, I mean, we discussed that earlier on. I mean, at least with hindsight, it was relatively easy to tackle with monetary and fiscal policy. I mean, what you did was, on the monetary policy side, you came up with QE and super low interest rates. And on the fiscal side, I mean, what for Moody's was really a game changer in Europe, a positive game changer, was Next Generation EU, which really supports sovereign and creditworthiness in Europe. But overall, the mix was clear, in a way, a loose monetary and a loose fiscal policy. And now with the energy crisis and the inflationary pressures, it's much more difficult, because the European Central Bank needs to anchor inflation expectations. I mean, that's the primary goal there, and that contradicts the need to support the economy. So it's very difficult to tackle. And the other thing, it's not a one-off. So it's in our view a transitioning to a new normal, and the new normal will have a different energy mix. Will probably have higher energy prices for longer. And in addition to that, there's probably no real end of the crisis. Yeah, I mean, with the pandemic, once everyone was vaccinated, the worst was over and we were behind the crisis. But with this energy crisis, probably there won't be a clear end of the crisis. And that's also very difficult from a fiscal perspective, because, I mean, with the pandemic, there's a clear situation where you can withdraw fiscal stimulus. But with the energy crisis now, I mean, at what point can you withdraw fiscal stimulus without hurting the population and the poorer part of the electorate? So that's why, in our view, even though the initial hit on GDP and on the fiscal side was less severe than what we have now with the, and I haven't talked about geopolitics on top. I mean, that's also a complete game changer for Europe. And, I come from Germany. Obviously, Germany completely miscalculated the Russian influence and the Russian ambitions here. And we are now at a situation where geopolitical risks are factored in our ratings on top of that. So what we did, still, for us, the advanced economies in Europe are credits that move quite slowly. So we don't see a cliff risk. We don't see a cliff risk for the United Kingdom. We don't see a cliff risk for Italy or other credits. These are well supported. And if there's market pressure, the UK was an example, there will also be course correction. And in Europe, we have a track record with that. Greece, for instance, which really was very close to euro area exit at the moment. And when the markets reacted, the Greeks shied away from exiting the euro area. So we believe that countries will course correct their policies if there's market stress. So let me conclude where we are at this moment. We just published our global sovereign outlook. It's negative, as you would probably expect. In terms of rating actions, what we've done so far this year is to assign a negative outlook on Czech Republic's AA3 and Slovakia's A2 rating, both driven by energy concerns in the first place. And we also have a negative outlook on Italy, on the Baa3 there. There, the situation is a bit more complex. The energy situation doesn't help, but it's more, it was discussed earlier on, really the growth perspective is something which is a concern to us. But at the same time, we stated that Next Generation EU is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Italy to improve growth perspectives and to turn and to keep debt to GDP and debt sustainability in place there. So that's where we are at the moment. We also have a negative outlook on the UK, but apart from that, it's still a stable environment, and I would say we have a constructive view on the European framework here. The ESM plays a role, but Next Generation EU was really a game changer, and I'm personally quite confident. And if in the case an additional crisis will hit or the energy crisis will get even worse, I believe that Next Generation EU could be a blueprint for further action at the European level. Leave it there.
Good. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I see from the body language of Greg that he doesn't want to intervene. Okay, so we are ready for the second round. Now, I think we go in reverse order. So let's start with Daniel, please.
Thanks a lot for having me speak again. Let me illustrate the importance of risk in another way. And I want to talk a few minutes about QE. Now, we all know that QE basically involves a shortening of the effective duration of government debt. The Banca d'Italia buys BTPs and finances that with short-term deposits from the banks or with target imbalances, which have also a very low interest rate. Now, this, I'm not against central bank buying government debt when there is panic in the market, like in February, March, April of 2020. But the question is, why was it necessary to continue? Why was it to actually increase the PEP? The justification of the ECB was we have to keep interest rates low to stimulate the economy. As a parenthesis, when you have a sectoral recession and people just can't consume, lowering the interest rate by, I don't know, basis points doesn't seem to me to be of a big help. But in doing this, basically the ECB took a very big fiscal risk. They implicitly seem to have assumed interest rates will stay low for longer, forever, right? Governments seem to have taken the same view because governments could have issued more long-term debt. The Austrians did 100-year debt, right? But most Euro area governments didn't really change the weighted average maturity of the debt they were issuing during this time. So now we are in a situation where the ECB or the Banca d'Italia discovers that they have locked in almost 4,000 billion euros of public debt, average maturity of 7 to 8 years at a low interest rate, close to 0.5 on average over all countries. And they're going to have to refinance that for the next 7, 8 years with their own deposit rate, which is now, I think, around 2% and is projected to go up to 3% next year, and who knows where it will be next. This means for every year they have to pay, let's say, 3% and get 0.5. They're making a loss of 2.5% on the 4,000 billion. Times, let's say, approximately 6 years, you can make the calculation, it's around a 50% loss. That's about the fall in the value of government bonds. That's around 600 billion. I think this is a pretty, big risk that was taken there, which nobody talked about. Apparently there was no risk management officer at the ECB. And the risk management officers at the national debt offices also weren't very active. But I think this is another illustration that an operation like this, basically during times of extraordinarily low rates, going short and issuing long, everybody should have told them that's dangerous. It's not a good idea. So again, I come back. I think risk, and especially tail risk, is really what should concern us these days.
Thank you. Again, in reverse order, Cosimo.
Thank you very much. I will start from where Professor Gros left. It's about maybe an element that could be interesting for further analysis is about the appetite, or where appetite is sitting in the moment for all this amount of debt. This has been produced at different levels because you have the ESM debt, you have also the European Commission budget debt has been produced, generated, will continue to be issued in the markets. So then you have all the national debt, etc. So, and all of them, they had pretty much the same or similar narrative. Should be a narrative of recovery or of creation of capacity, growth in economies. So looking at who's investing on Europe and investing in these instruments, and maybe is a crucial point, because it's all about the debt sustainability, but also the capacity to generate enough appetite in the market would be sustainable over time when compared, for example, to other assets or to other benchmark, etc. So for me, it's really, I don't want to take a lot of your time. I think it could be a very important topic to look at because, in my previous shop at the ESM, we're looking on a daily basis at the appetite globally. We have the capacity to analyze on the secondary market who was buying and selling ESM and also supranational debt. And I think it's an important piece here of information because then, as I said before, together with the debt, you also have a history and narrative we can start to attach more and more. Could be sustainability, could be a purpose you're focusing your funding for, or specific narratives of each different member state or different parts. So I don't want to take more of your time. I think it could be an important element to dwell into.
Thank you. Andrea, a snapshot.
Yes. So I didn't say anything about Italy in the first round. So let me say a few words, even because so I didn't say anything about Italy in the first round. And but when we talk about debt sustainability, as Daniel Gros just showed us, Italy comes in the mind of everybody. So I want to say a few words. A few days ago, I was in a meeting with a minister, and he or she used the following did the following statement that was interesting to me. He said, we have, as Italy, for the next year, 310 billion euros available, and we are fighting in the government to find 100 million in the budget. So the 310 billion are, I assume, the sum between the structural funds and the recovery plan funds. Okay. Why I'm saying that there is a huge amount of money available to do reforms and investment in the next 5 to 10 years, say. And it's of paramount importance that we use in the right way. In order to, say, rule out any discussion about debt sustainability in Italy. By the way, we discussed about debt sustainability in Italy for the last 25 years, 30 years, and Italy is still there and still one of the largest economies in the world. So maybe something is working in this country. But anyway, if we are able to use the 300 plus billion euros in the right way, it's not a matter of spending, but spending in the right way, I think we can structurally change the rate of economic growth and therefore allow the discussion or bring the discussion of that sustainability out. If we are not able to spend in the right way, or I would say in this case, if we don't spend much of those money, then the perception about Italy among markets, among investors will fall and will create a damage that is even larger than the damage due to the fact that we will not spend money. So we as a country, we need to do our best to increase structural growth using the money in the right way and to avoid to bring bad perception about Italy, the usual country that is not able to do things.
Maria?
Yes, I go back. I'm continuing the topic of market perception because it's absolutely crucial. So Daniel Gros mentioned the 100-year bond of Austria, but also Italy issued 50 years. So it is not so different. Pursuing a lengthening of the debt, especially being a big debtor, is very important. But you have to confront with the market appetite, and this depends from many factors. For example, in case of a very long-dated bond, when the rates were extremely low, was the necessity for investors like insurance or pension funds to have some pickup in yield combined by the rating level. So this is the story. Now, I believe is quite difficult because it's true that the rates are higher, but the curve is quite flat. And in the very long end is also slightly inverted. So it is difficult to attract investors for a 30 or longer bond when you receive higher rates in the 10 and a similar one in the 5. So we have also always to take into account what are the relative conditions in the market in a certain moment and the capability of meeting the demand, pursuing as much as possible the goal of that manager is also an element that contribute to the confidence in the market and to the sustainability of the debt. I mentioned before some excessive variability of political stance in Italy, the change in government, the change in solution and so on. But what has been always very appreciated by investors has been the continuity and the transparency of the management debt policy. And this has been in several moments an element that for sure is complementary to the major one, that is represented by the capability of the country to grow, to increase its efficiency as a system. But is something that has been able sometimes to reassure the market and to maintaining always the capability of refinancing the debt, and in many moments, in the majority of the moment, also to allow to maintain and sometimes increase the average life of the debt. This has been an element that is marginal, but not negligible.
Thank you. Now we have Roel online, so please, the floor is yours.
So thank you. I want to make 3 brief points. One is going back to what Daniel was saying, and that is, it may be true that at low debt levels, default is possible, and we've seen the cases of Ireland in the beginning of, well, that was the euro debt crisis. But I mean, ceteris paribus, if the debt ratio increases, the chances of default increase. And there is a strong empirical evidence that interest rates are linked to the debt ratio. And so if debt ratios increase, then again, ceteris paribus, interest rates increase. And so generally, I think it's wise to follow the way, a prudent debt policy. Maybe it's good to go back to Sweden, beginning of the 90s. There was the banking crisis, and this banking crisis meant 30% percentage points or so higher public debt. So a substantial increase that can happen quite suddenly. So that is one point. Then the second point, on the equilibrium interest rates, it's very hard to estimate what is the equilibrium interest rate or the long run interest rate. But maybe it will go up. It will be higher than we thought it was. Because saving for retirement may at some point level off, maybe not now, but in the future. At the same time, the investment needs are increasing substantially for digital transition, but especially for the climate transition. Huge investments will be needed, and that will by itself drive up equilibrium interest rates. Now, finally, on productivity, and Italy is my favorable holiday country. We go to Italy every year, and to different places. So this year I was at the Lago Maggiore, and what I noticed there is, in the Netherlands is a cold country, but every roof has solar panels, almost every roof. When I was at the Lago Maggiore, I saw barely any roof with solar panels. So what is going on? Is there maybe at a more micro level, are there obstacles to investments in green energy? I don't know. You know the situation in Italy, of course, better than I do. But what is making it difficult to have these investments? And I'm very curious to learn about that. Thank you.
Thanks. And we offer the final word positive word, of course, to Pier Carlo Padoan, and to finish up the day and our discussion. So
I didn't say I was going to be optimistic, so
I tried to.
Okay.
To push.
No, what I'll do, if you allow me, is I started my remarks earlier on with 3 questions, so I will provide myself with my own answers to those 3 questions. The questions were looking at the new environment in which debt sustainability should be assessed. One question is, where will growth come from? But I think that there is agreement in the room, or no disagreement in the room, that we will have more growth and sustained growth if we go through the NPRR and we implement it over time. That would be, I would say, a pretty probable situation of having sustained more growth than we had in the past. Second question, what about EMU architecture? Well, central fiscal capacity was mentioned by several speakers. No one spoke against the idea. Maybe there's more disagreement nowadays on how to reformulate the SGP, the Stability and Growth Pact, but certainly I think that there is implicit agreement that we need to reconsider the institutional architecture where we would have fiscal measures, but also measures to take into account the new challenges, including production of public goods, such as security, technology, but also other issues like migration and migration flows, which was very much at the heart of economic policy a few years back, when, let me remind all of us, Italy was alone in dealing with the issue until it was recognized that migration policy is a European public good, if there is one. Final point, my question was, what will happen when markets will no longer have negative or low interest rates? What will they price? So I take it that a very sophisticated answer came from Daniel, as usual, where he suggests that the R minus G formula may be misleading, and you may be thinking that you can sleep well, but you shouldn't sleep well because there are other reasons that might hide the risk of default or instability. And he did that introducing the distinction between uncertainty and risk, being risk a highly nonlinear variable which can interact with uncertainty in ways we certainly cannot predict. But bottom line, you think we have now more debt sustainability in Italy, you are wrong. We may have less. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I just realized that in the program here we have conclusions by myself and Pietro, so I don't know if you want to stay here to listen to me, but I just say 3 words, okay, and then we close it, and we have toast after that. So that's an important piece of information. Now, I think it was a fascinating discussion. Clearly, we couldn't cover everything, but I think at least the volume, I think it was successful in kind of stimulating the discussion, which is always useful and usually always good. I think many in the discussion mentioned the importance of growth and reforms. And Maria, the importance also of quality spending, because that is key. Now we are shifting towards the benchmark of spending, but there is spending and spending, so you need to move to quality spending. Now, I think that we have learned that we have to focus on some words that risk managers use, and probably we haven't used enough in our volume, but certainly it's worth remembering that there are some issues that needs to be, considered from a point of view also of a risk manager. And we have words that we haven't used actually, but we are very close to some of the words we have used, such as fat tails or non-linearity. And indeed, that seems to kind of inform our discussion here quite extensively, I would say, although we don't use these words. Also convexity and complacency, which, you know, is a very tricky concept, let's put it this way. I think we have heard from Moody's that it's not just debt to GDP, but Roel mentioned very clearly that unfortunately mathematics and arithmetics is very simple and straightforward, and so we cannot forget that. But it's good to know that it's not just that. Okay, that's reassuring. And finally, I think let's hope that Carlo used to call it a narrow path. Let's hope that it's not narrower today compared to a few years ago. I'll stop here. Maybe Pietro wants to say something. No, so post. Thank you.